Hi, everyone. I think we have our issues solved, so I'm going to bring Dr. Fred L. Johnson on. And if you missed any of this, you will be able to catch us on our YouTube channel as well as on our Facebook Live. Hi, Dr. Johnson.
Hi, Gloria. I'm so sorry we've had this issue.
And now, okay, great. I can hear you now. I was thinking, oh no, now I can see you. I can't hear you. Great. So, as my father would say, the wonders of technology, and it works out really great when it works, but when it doesn't, all of a sudden, it's like not.
Yeah.
And so now it seems like our viewers can see us as well, so we are all set. So I would, first of all, let me just start over with a brief introduction. So I'd like to welcome everyone to our Lakeshore Ethnic Diversity Alliance Community Conversation. We are having these weekly, and we hope that these conversations help you talk with other people and organizations and it will help us find common ground and address racial and ethnic inequities that are so present in our country. We hope that we can help you find common ground. I am Gloria Lara, and I am honored to be the Executive Director of the Lakeshore Ethnic Diversity Alliance. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Fred L. Johnson III. Dr. Johnson has teaches history at Hope College since fall 2000. Prior to his career in higher education, Dr. Johnson served in the United States Marine Corps as a communications electronics officer and as an infantry officer in the Marine Reserves. He subsequently worked for the Packard Electric Division of General Motors, Contel Page Telecommunications, and for Aircraft Braking Systems, which is formerly Goodyear Aerospace. Dr. Johnson's primary field of study is 19th century U.S. history, specifically the Civil War. His other areas of expertise are 20th century U.S. military and Africa. He has also completed a proposal for a course on the history of the Black Church. Welcome, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you, Gloria.
So I wanted to ask you to come on to talk to us about two topics which I believe you know quite a lot about. As Dr. Martin Luther King once observed, Sunday morning remains the most segregated hour in America. Can you talk a bit about how the Black churches in the U.S. became such an important part of Black life?
Sure. Usually, Gloria, when I'm talking about this, I tell people that the thing that they have to recognize first is that according to the vision that God had for the church, I mean, if you believe in the fact that there is God, that is a Trinitarian God, that there's a Father, Son, Holy Spirit, that God's vision, Jesus's vision for the church is that they're supposed to be the church, not a white church, not a black church, not an Albanian church, not a Croatian church, not a Venezuelan church, but the church of human beings. But in the United States, we have this thing called the Black church. And so to understand about the Black church, when I'm teaching the class, I always tell students that before we can start talking about Black preaching, the Gospels, gospel singing, Black theology, Black liturgy, or anything else having to do with the Black church, the one thing that we first must do is answer the question, why did there have to be a Black church in America? For a worldview, for a cosmologic view that says there should be only one church under the cross, why in this country was it necessary for African Americans to have something called the Black church? To understand that, you got to go back to the very beginning of the country. And I don't mean 1787 with the Constitutional Convention. I mean the colonial period. Because it is in that period where you have the colonial society being set up, where something called slavery is established, And here's probably it certainly isn't the only tragedy, but it's certainly one of the larger tragedies of how this country was established. The fact that early on there was indentured servitude, and out of indentured servitude, there arose or evolved a system called slavery. And that slavery wasn't just any kind of slavery, it was race-based slavery. It was a slavery that designated a certain group of people as being slaves in perpetuity. And then after that, there was an ideology that was developed that justified why those kind of people deserved to be and had to be enslaved. And originally, one of the earlier things that happened was that people used as the excuses in the 1600s, while America was still very much a colonial society, that Africans being brought to North America were not Christians. So the excuse was given that since they're not Christians, they have to be Christianized through the period of enslavement. And then at some point, once they are thoroughly Christianized enough, there's the possibility of freeing them. Well, during the 1600s also, they eventually just ejected that fiction and said you can still be baptized and Christianized, but now you'll still be a slave. So as the colonial society begins to evolve and develop more and more, and there is great profit to be made, not only in the slave trade, but also slave-produced products. We're talking about rice. We're talking about indigo. We're talking about eventually cotton for sure. Now, a whole range of products, and the original cash crop, tobacco, was the one that really made this system work. And it was clearing the land and putting people to work on it. Native Americans were not ideal laborers because they knew the land and they had a habit of fighting back. Not to mention, there was the issue of smallpox that was wiping out Native Americans in very large numbers. Africans did not know the land. They did not know the language. They stood out, obviously, and there were various different ethnic groups of Africans. And plus, they proved that they could actually work for long hours, day in, day out, 7 days a week. Once the economic foundation was established and the colonial society became dependent upon slavery for its prosperity, then all these other things started getting added onto it, like laws being passed, the ideology being developed. And then, just to give you an idea of how Black people became associated with slavery, one of the things that slaveholders would do, or did, was that they developed this thing called the Hamitic myth. Now, the Hamitic myth goes back to the story of Noah and the flood. After the flood, Noah spent a long period of time still on the ark before he was allowed to actually go on land. And upon getting off the ark, Noah got drunk. His youngest son, Ham, saw his father drunk and naked, asleep. Ham went and told his brothers, Shem and Japheth. Upon waking up, Noah was told by Shem and Japheth that Ham had told the two of them about his father being drunk and naked. So Noah apparently cursed Ham by saying, "You shall be a hewer of wood and drawer of water, and you will serve your other two brothers from now until your descendants." Well, based on that story, slaveholders said that Black people were the descendants of Ham, and that they were therefore cursed by Noah, and by extension, if Noah was one of God's prophets, if Noah is one of God's people, if Noah says this, then it's as good as coming from God. So if Noah said that the descendants of Ham, that is Africans, Black people, were to be in perpetuity the hewers of wood and drawers of water, servile laborers, in service to Shem and Japheth, their descendants, then that meant then, conveniently enough, that Black people were slaves not by man's decree, but by God's decree through one of his prophets. That was just one of many techniques that was used to, first off, use biblical scripture to justify slavery and then to maintain it. Now, at some point, as I said, during the colonial period, especially as you start getting toward the 1700s, they just start getting away from the fiction of using scripture and just say, listen, slavery is just too profitable for us not to do this. But by 1700, what you have in colonial North America is a system of slavery that has predominantly Black people in it, and Black people being both descendants of Africans and brown or Black and slaves. They end up being racially categorized and classified as to being the people who are appropriately enough by biblical decree and social design to be enslaved for generations. The eventual movement called the First Great Awakening, which was right around the late 1730s into the 1740s. We have people like George Whitefield, an evangelist who comes to America, and he's one of these guys that goes from town to town. You know, he's not your typical sort of preacher from the Anglican church tradition. He's very fiery. He's very charismatic. He's got a lot of gestures, and so he believes in the emotionalism of it all. And he actually preached to Black people. George Whitefield was not an abolitionist, but he preached to Black slaves. And a lot of people wonder, well, why on earth would Black people take on the religion of their slave masters? Early on, there's a scholar at Ashland Theological Seminary in Ashland, Ohio, Dr. William Myers, who says that even though African Americans, or these Africans descendants of slaves, were not literate, the laws prevented them to learn to read and write. Because even slaveholders understood that when people learned to read and write, they began asking questions. They began critically thinking. They began questioning their environment. And the last thing you want slaves doing is questioning their predicament. So the way to do that is to keep them in intellectual darkness. There's a reason why men did not want women to go to school for a long time. Because after all, women are just supposed to do what? Be wise mothers and be doing what they're told. When you educate people, it gives them the tools to start changing their lives, changing their world, and pushing against power structures that may be oppressing them. So it is not at all an accident that slaves were by law prevented from learning to read and write.
So
yes,
this is a really fascinating, great timeline, taking us back to the beginning. And I can definitely see why it really grew that way. When you look at all those different forces and all those different influences to really affect how America looks at people of darker skin.
right.
Because the Bible said so. Can you then talk about, you started talking a little bit how the Black church and the African church started really coming together. Can you talk about how they were really a big influence on the civil rights movement?
Well, let me do this first, Gloria, because people didn't just, it's still a question of, well, all right, you have Black people who are enslaved, and you have slave masters who eventually come around. By the time you get to the mid 1700s, the late 1700s, and they're at least allowing sometimes slave preachers to give sermons, always under the watchful eye of the white overseer or the white plantation owner. Usually there's somebody there to make sure that the Black slave preacher, if in fact it's a Black person who's delivering that word, is going to deliver it in a way that will reinforce the system of slavery, rather than delivering the message of liberation and freedom and liberty, which was the message that Christ came. And not just spiritual liberation, not just spiritual liberty, not just spiritual opportunity, but physical and material as well in this life. Well, in 1787, the year of the Constitutional Convention, in Philadelphia, the year where the Constitutional Convention was held, where the delegates met in Philadelphia in 1787 to first review the Articles of Confederation, the nation's first governing document, which we don't have time to get into how they were proven to be insufficient at the time, but the delegates got there. They were going to initially look at how they could edit and upgrade the Articles of Confederation. Then they decided, you know what? He just isn't doing the job. So they decided to draft an entirely new document. In that same year, in that same city, at a place called St. George Episcopal Church, there were African Americans who were attending that church in Philadelphia. Now, in the book North of Slavery by Leon F. Litwack, talking about racism in the North from 1790 to 1860, he tells the story of a man named Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones both were African Americans, and they were part of a number of African Americans who had been attending St. George Episcopal Church. On this one occasion, on a Sunday, where they have been very much accustomed to sitting on the main floor of the church, sometimes toward the front in pews, they were asked to move upstairs to the gallery. Now, they called the gallery, let's call it like this, inward heaven. That's what they called it. So the Black people were asked to move upstairs because as St. George Episcopal Church started becoming more and more popular and more people knew about it, they started getting more and more white congregants. Well, the presence of Black people inside the church was an insult to their eyes. So the Black folks were asked to move upstairs so they would be out of sight. And then after they moved upstairs, they were asked to move to the back of the gallery. So now it's not enough just for them to go upstairs so they're out of sight, but now they're asked to be moved to the back of the gallery as well. Now, this one particular Sunday, Richard Allen recounts the incident where Absalom Jones and several other African Americans were on their knees praying. I need to emphasize that. They're literally on their knees praying to the God of heaven, the creator of heaven and earth, the almighty maker of everything. And in the midst of these human beings talking to their creator, the trustees of the church come upstairs to the gallery and yank them off their knees in the middle of prayers and tell them that they have to leave, and find someplace else even more obscure to pray. And Richard Allen was so completely just astounded by that these mere mortals, who after all, Richard Allen is a literate man, he's one of the few literate men, he's saying, I can't believe that these individuals who are mere mortals like me would dare get in the way of human beings talking to their God. They don't even care about this. What is wrong with them? In that incident, that's when Richard Allen and Absalom Jones decided that Sunday. They left that church and he never came back. That was the beginning of the independent Black church movement in America. And Bishop Richard Allen was one of the first and earliest leading figures of what became known as the African Methodist Episcopal Church. You see, it wasn't that Black people weren't worshiping God, and it wasn't that they didn't want to worship God. It's just that they figured out that if they're going to worship God the way they want to, if they want to follow the book, if they want to worship the Christ the way they want to, they weren't allowed to do it with their white brothers and sisters. So not worshiping God isn't an option. So if you are not going to be allowed to worship with people and you still intend to worship God, that means you have to do it outside on your own, establishing your own institution. So that's just one example of a beginning of something that became known as the Black church. And over time, that Black church became a haven for people to get recharged in the week from the daily harassment and insults and humiliations that they had to endure. The Black church became a force for education. The Black church became a relief society for people when they needed financial help. The Black church became a participant in the Underground Railroad. The Black church was stood as a bulwark against the counter theology that was constantly battering Black people, telling them that they were just above animals and sometimes even less than animals. The Black church became that institution that was the countervailing force in the United States. That for people that wanted to worship God, that was the institution where they could go to it and get theology that, irrespective of what slaveholders said, Black folks in their hearts, in their spirits, and those who eventually became educated knew, like Dr. Myers would say at Ashland, that something was rotten in Denmark.
Wow. Well, thank you, Dr. Johnson. I try not to put in any personal comments, but I am an Episcopalian. And learning this is really, to me, very foundational about how the two churches digressed or separated. But I wonder what the people in Philadelphia would say now, knowing that the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church of the United States, Michael Curry, is African American. And for those of you who may not know who Michael Curry is, he was the one that gave the sermon at the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. So he was the one that actually brought a lot of the aspects of what was going on in the Episcopal Church in the U.S. as opposed to now, as opposed to history. So thank you so much for that. I will definitely personally take that information and use it at my parish. So I wanted to segue to another topic. Lately in the news, there's been a lot of discussion about this date or day called Juneteenth, Juneteenth.
Right. Yeah.
And there's been a lot of controversy about different people celebrating or not celebrating or ignoring it. Could you please talk about what is Juneteenth? What is it? How did it begin? And what is its significance?
Juneteenth, the date for Juneteenth is June 19th, 1865. And it was the date in Texas where Black folks across the state finally had it announced to them that not only were they free, but that the Civil War had been over since April 9th. It just, Juneteenth, among other things, in addition to telling yet another group of Black people that they were free, and they had been free practically since the end of the Civil War on April 9th, 1865. They had been free symbolically since the release of the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. But Juneteenth is celebrated because people finally found out that they were free. But Juneteenth is also illustrative of the absolute determination of slaveholders and white supremacists to make sure that the status quo they had before the Civil War would either not go away or last as long as possible, or be recreated to the status quo ante with whatever means they had available to them. The arrival of Juneteenth, the occasion of Juneteenth, wasn't because people were so far flung, because certainly people in California knew that the Civil War had ended, and they knew about the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment had been passed in early 1865, well before the end of the war. So it stands as, yes, another example of just exactly how slaveholders and supremacists were determined to hang on to their power, hang on to the economic advantages of having Black people tied to the land, working for nothing, also known as slavery, for as long as possible. And so it is celebrated today as yet another milestone on the road to liberty, on the road to freedom, on the road to what was hoped for economic opportunity. Of course, from 1865 to 1877, during that period that Americans call Reconstruction, a lot of things happened. The 13th Amendment was passed that abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment was passed that dealt with due process, equal protections, and dual citizenship. And the 15th Amendment was passed that the good thing about the 15th Amendment was that it gave Black men the right to vote. The sad thing about the 15th Amendment was that it still did not give women the right to vote. Women will have to fight for that right into the 20th century. But these big incremental steps, 3 major constitutional amendments that were all designed to once and for all rip the spine out of what had been slavery. And Juneteenth, again, is at the very beginning of that whole process of Reconstruction, where you see African Americans who just months before had been either ostracized, marginalized, or enslaved. Now you're getting African American congressmen, senators before it's all over with, postmasters. In other words, people actually begin to move into the mainstream, or at least more into the mainstream, of what it means to be an American citizen, to be covered with the rights and privileges of the Constitution, but also the responsibilities of the Constitution as well as citizens. But as the smoke is settling and the dust is clearing in the aftermath of the Civil War, Southerners are not losing a moment to figure out how they can reconstruct the society of dominance that they had. And for African Americans who will be voting, for African Americans that have a voice in public, for African Americans that are moving out and getting jobs and demanding wages and negotiating contracts, all these things, they mean to do away with all of that. For example, in 1866 in Pulaski, Tennessee, the Civil War was not even over for a full year before the Ku Klux Klan was founded. They, of course, will become the domestic terror arm that white supremacists will use for the murdering, the lynching, the arsons, the harassment, the humiliation, anything that's done under the name of domestic terrorism, it can be attributed to them. But then you have other movements that will go along where Reconstruction will be one law at a time, one event at a time, deconstructed. It doesn't help at all that in the early years of Reconstruction, from 1865 until, let's say, 1868, the election of 1868, that Abraham Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, himself is absolutely antagonistic to Black people. He was a Southerner from Tennessee. He had been a somewhat okay wartime governor. He was, a smart choice for Lincoln during his second administration to have as a running mate. But Andrew Johnson was absolutely antagonistic toward Black people. He did not like the planter class. Andrew Johnson did not like the people who had made life so hard for him. He blamed the slaveholders and the slaves for the difficult time that he had as a young man growing up, and the fact that he had to scrape and scrimp so hard to become the man that he was. So when he basically came into office after Lincoln's assassination, he basically let the Southerners run their own Reconstruction program until the Congress stepped in and said, we have not fought a civil war just for the people that were part of the Confederate government to go back and recreate the same conditions that brought the war on in the first place. So it moved from this thing historians call presidential Reconstruction to congressional Reconstruction, where the Republican Party that was dominated by people who became known as Black Republicans. They were called Black Republicans because they passed a lot of legislation that was friendly toward getting African Americans their civil rights. And this eventually set up a confrontation between Johnson and the Congress that resulted in the attempt to impeach him over a violation of something called the Tenure of Office Act of 1867, where he tried to remove the Secretary of War. And given that Edwin M. Stanton had been appointed by the Senate or approved by the Senate, they passed legislation that guaranteed a confrontation between the president and the Congress. He missed being impeached by one vote. But after being impeached, he pretty much was neutralized for the remainder of his presidency, and the Congress took over the greater part of Reconstruction. Now, Juneteenth is significant in all that, but you can see that the symbology of Juneteenth goes right in line with the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment that gave that dual citizenship. And here's the thing that I say about citizenship, Gloria, when it comes to the 14th Amendment, because I've talked to people sometimes, and they want to go back and revisit the 14th Amendment and change the language. And I go like, oh, wait, because unless you understand what the original purpose was, you could very well end up writing yourself out of citizenship. Now, in 1866, 67, 68, what do you do when you got 4 million Black people in the country? They haven't snuck across the border. They haven't parachuted in. They're born in the United States, but they're not citizens, because until then, they have been property. Now they're born here, but they're not citizens. So are they citizens of the state in which they belong, or citizens of the nation? So the 14th Amendment clarifies that. People who are born here they're citizens by virtue of birth, or they can be naturalized. And you are not only a citizen of the state to which you belong, but a citizen of the nation to which that state is a part of. That's why it's called dual citizenship. And I have to remind my students sometimes that, it's not like people haven't lost citizenship with the stroke of a pen before. In 1935 in Nazi Germany, under the Nuremberg laws, Jews were basically written out of their citizenship with the stroke of a pen. Not allowed to run businesses, not allowed to have people frequent their places of business, not allowed to vote. Just basically became stateless overnight because of a hostile regime. So we should be very, very careful when it comes to things like that.
Thank you. So I have another question. As a historian, Dr. Johnson, how can we look to our history to help us continue to make progress in this current moment? What are some important lessons that we should remember that can help us in this current movement, but for justice for Black Americans?
You know what, Gloria? One of the things that my students tell me, especially in this history of the Black church class, I taught a class at the college this past spring called Slavery and Race in America, 1619 to present. And because I teach at a small Christian liberal arts college in the upper Midwest, and it's predominantly white, most of my students were white. So when we start talking about the kind of things I've been sharing the last few moments, my students tell me that much of what I'm telling them is new. They said that their education up to that point on this subject was, there was slavery, which was, kind of bad. Then there was a civil war, Black people got free. Martin Luther King Jr. made a speech called I Have a Dream, that everything was okay. Then we start filling in the blanks. And we start talking about a thing called the actual laws that were passed for slavery. Things like, things in the colonial period where a law was passed in Virginia that said the child follows the condition of the mother, meaning that a child in utero, a child still in the mother's womb, if the mother's a slave, that child, before it's born, before it takes its first breath of air, before its feet hit the ground, before it ever has sunlight kiss its face, it's already doomed to a lifetime of slavery based on the condition of the mother. They don't know about that kind of stuff. They don't know about the lynching that took place in America from 1880 until, well, if you count what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis, until 2020. The fact that so many people got lynched, and the fact that we look at the picture of, for example, what happened in Marion, Indiana in 1930-31, when Abe Smith and Tommy Shipp were lynched outside on a tree right outside the courthouse. And they don't know about James Cameron, the only man to survive a lynching. They don't know about redlining. Some of them have never heard of redlining before. Or what happened after World War II when African Americans, because the Democratic Party was dominated by bigots in the South, the Democratic Party, those Southerners, did not allow African American soldiers, for the most part, coming back from World War II, ironically enough, having fought one of the most bigoted, racist regimes in all of history, but certainly not the history of the 20th century. They come back, can't get access to home loans or education from the GI Bill because Southern senators and congressmen made sure that they did not get access to those benefits. And those guys have served their country. They don't know about why the men of the 54th Massachusetts on July 18th, 1863 would charge up a hill, in a blazing hot sun in the middle of July, being the tip of the point of the spear, to be the first into a frontal assault where they're guaranteed to be slaughtered on that day. We need to talk about all that kind of stuff. So how can the history help us? The first way that the history can help us is by knowing it. And then I tell them that if we know it, because people like to always say, well, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. My contention is human beings are not that efficient to repeat history that way. But history does have echoes. History has echoes. And so for my purposes, knowing and teaching the history will give us the tools to sit down and have a conversation about this stuff. Because then if we know what is going on, then we are more capable of addressing the issues of the day. Because it's just like any kind of explosion that happened. The Watts riots of 1966, or what happened in Detroit in 1967, the Long Summers. Those aren't things that just all of a sudden happen. Those are expressions of things that build over a long, long period of time. And they're built on a foundation of many years of oppression. One of the things I point out to people, because sometimes I had a colleague that used to ask me to come in and give an interpretation of Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. And I had read that address so many times, but I don't know, just this one particular day, while I was reading it, I saw what the president wrote. He said that in his inaugural, that it had already been 246 or 250 years of unrequited toil. Now, Abraham Lincoln is saying this on March 4th, 1865. He's saying that on March 4th, 1865, it had already been 250 years of unrequited toil. If you look at 1865 to 1965, that's another 100 years of Jim Crow, segregation. The Southerners won. I had my students look at a documentary on redlining in Minneapolis. They were absolutely flabbergasted to see that the segregation in Minneapolis and the segregation, the redlining, the discrimination, the marginalization of African Americans in a northern city. If you told them Biloxi or Montgomery, Alabama or Birmingham, they'll go like, okay, well, that's the South, you know, slavery, blah, blah, blah. They get that part, but to understand that it also happened in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Cleveland, Minneapolis, Detroit, just as well. So that knowing the history gives us my hope as a scholar, my hope as an American, my hope as somebody, as a person of faith, is that if we have the tools and the knowledge and the critical thinking that goes along with it, and we are willing to engage in a civil conversation. I mean, a conversation where the two of us are talking to each other, not trying to talk over each other, and really sincerely trying to reach a resolution on this, for reconciliation. And I'm not talking about lament. You know, people have been lamenting stuff. Lamentation is great. Now it's time to talk about policies and solutions and implementation. But we can't do that without the knowledge.
Well, thank you, Dr. Johnson. It has been, it's despite the technical difficulties, really, really fascinating and amazing to listen to you. There are so many topics that we could have delved into, and I'm certain that you would have very interesting thoughts for us to look at and consider. You know, I looked at some of the comments that were on Facebook, and one of them said that, you know, our history books need an overhaul. And I think we've been talking about that for a while. So thank you, Dr. Johnson. And we hope to have you back again sometime in the future.
Sure.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Bye.
Bye-bye. So thank you for sticking with us. You can tell your friends that we will actually have this video up on our website with links to our new YouTube channel, which is LEDA, L-E-D-A, Ethnic Diversity. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as announcements on our Facebook page. We will actually post an announcement on our Facebook page that the recording did happen, and have links to it on our Facebook page as on our website as soon as possible. And you may have heard me talk about our summit. Our 2020 summit is on July 21st. It is a virtual summit. We will be sending out an announcement, we believe, by the end of this week, which is just a couple more days, to let you know that registration is open. You can register. And, you know, for people who are wondering, am I going to have to sit in front of a Zoom screen for, you know, from 9 to 4? No, you're not. You will be sitting in front of a screen, but you will be listening to speakers. You will be able to go into breakout rooms. You will be able to interact with the participants. So stay tuned for that. And thank you so much for viewing us. And we hope to see, and we will be seeing you next week. Thank you so much. Goodbye.